Welcome, everyone. Can you hear it now? All right, that's great. Well, I would like to introduce Miner, our consultant, and the lady who's going to let you know how to research your properties and what national registration is, national register nomination is all about.
Thank you very much. Okay, Lynn wants me to talk into this because she's videotaping this event. And it means that whenever any of you make a comment or a question, I'm going to try to as well so it all gets captured on tape. Sort of hate using these, but okay. So just to introduce myself, I'm Kristen Miner. Let's see, I was the chair of the Landmarks Commission in Portland up until December. Just finished my 8 years doing that for the city of Portland. They don't pay you for that, incidentally, but that's okay. My background is in architecture, so I got licensed in New York City a really long time ago. Like many of the properties that I research, I'm definitely historic, and I'll talk to you about what that means in a minute. And I moved to Portland in the 90s. And have happily raised my family. I worked for the Planning Bureau for quite some time, and went into historic preservation. And so that is my work now. I have my own business as a consultant, and I often work with jurisdictions like this one, West Linn, or many times with higher ed. A lot of those have like older campuses, and when they work on buildings, they always want to make sure that they're doing it the right way. So those tend to be my kind of bread and butter. But I always love working with communities that want to find out more about their history. So the McLean House in particular that Lynn mentioned, I am writing the nomination with that. And one of the super interesting things that came out about that house, not just its architecture, which is significant in itself, but it's also significant because Dr. McLean, who lived at that house, developed one of the United States' very first HMOs, which is a health maintenance organization. You probably all know that acronym, but just to make sure. So it's a pretty interesting story that kind of puts West Linn on the map in a very specific little thematic health and medicine category. And I'll talk more about that too, the sort of different categories that we're going to be looking for when we put anything on either the national register or local register. Okay. My notes. Oh, Lynn Schroeder with the city, just to make sure everyone knows who Lynn is. And Lynn, did you say we might have John Floyd? Oh, good, good. I wasn't sure that was you. Okay, John. John will be helping me out with maybe some of the aspects of local listing, so local designation. And thank you very much for all of you. So go ahead and let's start. Let's see. To slide number 2. This was really just the intro. Great. Okay. Yeah, that's a little hard to read from there, but I'll try to tell you what's on this slide. This is the second workshop that I am conducting for the city of West Linn. The first one was in October, And I just wanted to acknowledge this slide that the funding to do these sessions came from the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office. That's an organization that I'm going to be referring to as SHPO, for the State Historic Preservation Office. I hope that's okay to just use that acronym all through my presentation. The state office down in Salem is super helpful, and I'm going to be giving you, in fact, a contact or two if any of you are interested in National Register. They are very helpful. They hold my hand through every nomination, and they can do the same for you. So not only the SHPO, but also the National Park Service, these sessions. I think my slide says that my presentation is going to take 90 minutes. Let's scratch that. I'm really going to aim to talk for no more than an hour, and then we can have some time for questions or comments. Next slide. Great. So in any designation, if you're listed on the National Register, there are a couple of ways that can happen. One of them is by being part of a district. So I know some of you mentioned historic districts. You probably know what those are. And in West Linn, there is one National Register listed district, the Willamette. And so you can be listed on the National Register just as contributing to that district. You can also be listed on the National Register individually, without the benefit of, a whole district, just to kind of help make the case around you for why a place is important. If a place is listed individually, there's a higher burden of proof. In other words, there's going to be a little bit more to the story. There's more that you have to prove. But in any designation, there's 3 things that have to be present and that you have to really talk about. One of those is significance. Another is integrity. And finally, I didn't even put the slide, age. Age is a little bit of a slippery slope because there are ways that you can get around that requirement. But in general, and a good rule of thumb is you have to be at least 50 years old. So 50 years old or older qualifies you to start digging into the other requirements, right? There are certainly places that have been listed on the National Register that are younger than that, but you have to jump through some hoops to explain exceptional significance. So it makes the job harder. Now, I'll get into these concepts a little bit more, but integrity measures how much the building or place is still like it was built, or when events happened that made it significant. So you just have to kind of measure how it looks today with how it was then. Significance really means that it's a synonym for importance, right? So you're going to be talking about the place in relationship to similar houses or properties. Why is mine more important? That's information. This slide is also showing the front covers of 2 extremely helpful publications, both of which are easily available online. They are totally free if you just look at them online. One of them is written by the National Register, and it's called Bulletin 16A. I know, ridiculous. But it's really just how to list a property on the National Register, and it walks you through every single spot on that kind of can be somewhat tedious form for National Register. And I have some examples, and I'll get you more familiar with what a National Register form looks like in a minute. The other document is written by our own SHPO in Salem, and it's basically assistance with National Register document, but it's also, it can be pretty helpful if you're going to do local designation as well, because it explains some concepts and sort of gets, those general concepts in pretty well explained. So I would recommend, even if you're not going for National Register, that you do look at that document. What does it mean to be listed on the National Register? The National Register designation does come with some responsibilities and some benefits. It's a pretty light touch these days. The state has removed some of those responsibilities, but they also have removed some of those benefits. So I would say it's honestly, it's an honorific designation. It does protect a building from demolition, and that is about the biggest benefit that that you'll get sort of statewide. But it also comes with some eligibility for grants. There are grants that come from the SHPO. There are grants from private sources. And so, it sort of gets your foot in the door to apply for a few things that, pots of money that you otherwise would not be able to try for. Let's see, here in West Linn, National Register designation, as well as local designation, help me, does ask that there be an external review of changes before those changes take place. John is nodding. Yes. Okay. So there's nothing that's going to come into the house or property if some of you own a building that's not a residence. But external changes do require a review with the city. Now, I'm also noting on this slide that there are alternatives to National Register. And as we mentioned, one of those is as a local or city landmark. And West Linn has about 25 local landmarks. Is that right, Jim? Yeah, thanks. And there's also, for any of you that might live outside of the formal boundaries of West Linn, there you could go for designation as a Clackamas County landmark. And I listed a contact number. There's, I believe she still works at Clackamas County, but if not, they'll be able to find you someone that can help you do that. But it'll be a very similar process to local listing here in West Linn. Now, this is the section where I start talking about how find out if your property is eligible for historic designation. I think Lynn had already mentioned that there have been multiple surveys done in West Linn. And that is always a really good leg up on information that somebody else has already found out. And one way you can find that is by going to the Oregon Historic Sites database. And that is a database that the SHPO runs. It's, it's not very beautiful. They don't have photos or anything that go with the each listing, but you can find out if somebody has surveyed your property. You can just put in the address, and you should get some information. If your property doesn't come up, well, that's okay too. It just means that nobody has formally surveyed your property yet. Yes. Okay. Right. Good point. The system is old, it's a little glitchy, and it doesn't always have uh, properties listed by the correct and current address, I would say. So yes, take it with a grain of salt, but do check first, because the chances are, if your property has been surveyed, you can find that information. Now, so there have been surveys conducted not only in the Willamette Historic District that I'm showing up there on the top of the screen, and then in other areas of West Linn, Bolton, and Sunset. Yeah. But then, so what I'm showing at the bottom of the screen there is just a little screenshot from the Oregon SHPO historic sites database, excuse me. So you can look at it in map mode and just go ahead and sort of move around. And if you see a dot, you can click on it and the information will come up. So try a couple of different ways, looking through that database.
Kristen?
Yes.
Can I ask a question about, it says not eligible, so that I assume that it had been surveyed, but for some reason it wasn't eligible. Does that mean they can't, that it's not at all eligible, or they could try again, but with more research?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Lynn. So there are multiple ways. In fact, I'll walk you through them in the next slide, that surveyors sort of rate a property, if you will, or decide if it's eligible to be listed on the National Register. One of those, in fact, let's go ahead and switch to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So when a surveyor takes a look at a property, they have to give it one of these designations, and those are eligible significant, that it's individually eligible, eligible as contributing, so if it is or could be part of a district, demolished, that's usually if something was there and then they get surveyed again and it's no longer there. Not eligible, not contributing, and that generally means that it has had some major renovation or remodeling, as people sometimes call it. The next one is not eligible out of period, and that's an interesting one, that because that can change. So keep in mind that properties kind of age into being eligible all the time. So if your property was surveyed 15 years ago and somebody said, oh, well, it's too young, maybe now it's eligible, right? So that's one way that a property might be eligible. The other concept that I want to strongly encourage people to think about is that when surveyors do these surveys, they are almost always looking just at the architecture. And there are quite a few other ways that a property might be significant. So it's not just through its architecture as an important, sort of work of an architect or anything like that. But that's often the only thing that a survey is able to measure. When they go out and they're just walking a neighborhood, they're really not doing a lot of deep research. They might have a list of when that property was built. They might have a very first pass at sort of who lived there, but it's not going to be in depth at all. So most of what they're telling you about is it architecturally significant? So as a property owner, there are other ways that you might say, well, that surveyor didn't know that, my grandfather developed the first HMO in the United States or whatever it was, right? We're going to talk about that. Yeah. Yeah, let's go ahead and next slide, Lynn. So significance is the most important thing for a property to gain historic status. It's basically, it is its importance, and it's how that importance is defined. So every level and type of designation, whether it's contributing to a district, individually on the National Register, or local designation, uses 4 categories to really talk about significance. And just in short, those categories are about events, people, architecture, or archaeology. I'll explain those more in a second. And the first one, events, that's criteria A right here, at the very bottom of this slide. It's really the broadest category of all because it means contributing to history under one or more themes. And so, it could be social history, like, Japanese American history. It could be like Dr. McLean's house, health and medicine. It could be many other, it could be commerce, the development of commerce. There are many different themes under this broad category of significance about events, because events doesn't really mean like, a single day period. Sometimes it can be unfolding over many decades. So that can be a hard one to wrap your head around, but I think, oh yeah. So there's a little quote on the bottom that I pulled from some nomination here. That's just explains the Castle Ballroom, and this is a property in St. Louis, Missouri, is locally significant under National Register Criterion A. So that's about events again, in the area of Black ethnic heritage and in the area of entertainment recreation. So it's going to talk about, so that it's going to set up, well, why was it important to the Black community? And then also, why was it significant as a ballroom? So the nomination is going to explain those 2 themes. Okay, next slide. So here are the other three significance categories. B is, and you don't have to remember the letters, just know that they will be cropping up with, the literature that you read about these significance categories. So B is about association with the lives of significant persons. So this can overlap with A somewhat. And in order to, kind of determine that, you could ask yourself, is this property the single property that's most associated with a historic figure or an important person in my community, or maybe even at the state level? So there are, there's multiple ways that you can sort of get at the similar themes between criteria A and B. But just know that B is really all about a significant person and how they touched and were associated with that property. Next is C, which is about architecture, basically. So C is often what people think of when they think of a property being listed on the National Register. They think, oh, it is probably a really, sort of beautiful, intact house or property. Well, that could certainly be what it is, but it could also be a really, perhaps it's an example of a type of construction that most, that's pretty rare, or that's hardly seen. So it could be perhaps a type of building, a round barn or something that is, again, an example of a type of building that's not necessarily built by an architect or grand or beautiful, but just think about it as a really, a really good example of something that we wouldn't want to lose. The final one, D, is really about archaeology. And this is one that I have never written a nomination under this criteria because I'm not an archaeologist. But there are definitely a lot of properties in West Linn that have ties to not only our own white settler history, but the history of people long before us who lived on this land. And so try to delve deeper than just the sort of initial look at who owned the house or who built the house, because the property itself could be tied to something older than the house itself. So archaeology is basically geared towards underground resources or resources that are no longer standing, if you. I think at this point I'm going to hand out some National Register nominations and do just a quick exercise. You can all trade if you don't like. This old one, John. And some of these are just from my own collection, so please, some of them have scribbles on them, I'm sorry. As a landmarks commissioner, you have to review these. And they also, some of them are printed on one side of the paper and the side is used. So disregard everything that's in the back. I think you need your own. You can switch with me. Now, these were written at different points in history. So the more modern nominations are definitely easier to read. There's also a lot more information in them. Older nominations are, they tend to be a little thinner. There's not as much information in them, and they are, they just don't have the deep bibliography or other components to them. So whenever we come across an older nomination, chances are that, it could use more rigorous research and writing, but once it's on the National Register, it's going to stay on the National Register unless the property falls down for some reason. It's rare for a property to be taken off the National Register. It can happen, but you basically have to write sort of the same rationale that got it onto the register and explain why it no longer meets those criteria. So nobody wants to go through that exercise, which is really why places stay on the National Register. Now, I passed these out because I would like you to see if you can find out which criteria, A, B, C, D, each of these were listed under. And some of them have two. And if you can't find it on the nomination you got, it is possible that I can give you a different nomination, because a few of them really are kind of hard to get through, especially if it's an older nomination. Is anyone located? Should be within, it's typically within the first 2 or 3 pages that you'll see the criteria. You found it? Nope. Architecture. Great. Just architecture? Yep. Okay. Very good. Find yours. Yeah. Is okay. There's both criteria A and C. So architecture and then community planning and development under C. Excellent. Social significance. Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, that's the period of significance. Here, I'm going to kind of show you. Okay. To our should be the right page. Yeah. Exactly. So you have criterion B. So about the mayor of Lake Oswego. Yeah. Either of you find? Awesome. Did you find it in yours? Excellent. Excellent. Okay. So as you can see, there are often combinations. The National Register is it's not really set up for a whole bunch of separate arguments, but you know, there are still often more than one reason to list a property, but you really only need one. So just so you know, there's if you can make a case for significance under any one category or criteria, you don't need to add the others unless you really want to, and it's fine. If anyone would like to, you know, trade nominations or sort of look at a different one, I've got a couple really fat one here for the Central Methodist Episcopal Church in Portland. Okay. Well, feel free to just trade with someone or look at another one, because I do want you to kind of see a little bit about the variation in National Register. A current form, you know, is going to look like this. But I think many of you, yeah, that's a current one. That's a fairly, yeah, that's changed just a little bit, but that's still not too bad. There's a few from the, you know, from the 80s in here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they are actually. You can go, there's a National Register, shoot, I'm not going to remember. You're going to have to Google it. I'm not going to remember what the site is called, but you can definitely look up National Register nominations by state if you want, or by other criteria. Yeah, so it can be kind of fun to play around and read those. Actually, they are for Oregon properties. So that Oregon Sites database, if you locate a property that is on the National Register, there's a link to the actual nomination in there. Point. Okay, let's go back to, I think we can do next slide here. Integrity. For any of you that, I mean, feel free to look at these more, or to look at, I just kind of add them to this pile. To continue about the three things that any property needs, let's talk about integrity here for a second. And integrity really just, it's referring to the authenticity of a property, and that's evidenced by the survival of physical characteristics, right? So it is referring back to the architecture of the property, but really just to kind of make the case that the property is still similar to how it was in the period that you're talking about. And anytime you are going to talk about integrity, there's almost certainly changes that have occurred to any property over time. And that's okay. Properties do and can, and even maybe should, change a little bit over, you know, the span of time that building has been with us. Very common alterations of historic buildings. I'm just listing some here, especially for houses, can be the siding has changed. The roof is almost always changed. I mean, can you think of a place that hasn't been re-roofed? Many people have added, you know, it's a little bump out or even side to the house. Maybe there's a garage that got added. And then windows. Many of what we see, unfortunately, are vinyl replacement windows. But so, and then also removal of window details like old trim or a window. So none of these are necessarily going to knock your house out of the running. But if there's, you know, more than a couple of changes, you might be facing, you know, that your house just does not have enough integrity to look like it did. So don't be scared. Don't be worried if your house does have changes. It might still be okay and be sufficient for the National Register. I also did want to mention here, talking about integrity, that for the local register, integrity is not really as big a deal. John's nodding. So, you know, some degree of change might, you know, knock you out of running for the National Register, but it's would be fine for the local register. So just keep that in mind. Slide. I'm going to talk now about research. Such a nerd. I love research. I know many of you noticed when you came in that there are some handouts. So I wanted to illustrate what those are. These are handouts that I mostly developed initially because I was teaching a University of Oregon class. There's a Masters of Historic Preservation program that the University of Oregon does. It used to be in Portland, and it is unfortunately going to be moving to Eugene, so they're not going to get me as a teacher anymore. But it is a great program, and I hope it thrives. I hope it does well down in Eugene when it moves down there. But I got to teach students a architectural survey class. And that's really sort of the first component in writing any National Register or even local register anyway, is doing, you know, sort of really looking at and describing what you have. So the handouts, we'll start with there's a little 2-pager, which is, I tried to make this very specific to Clackamas County and even to West Linn. It gives you a whole bunch of links to sources. And I'll be referring to some of these when I talk through, you know, how to research your property. But these are very helpful. There is, just so you know, there are a few sources that are available at the Multnomah Public Library. You can be a member of Multnomah Public Library even if you don't live in Multnomah. So FYI, it's definitely worth getting a library card in order to do some of this research if you're serious about figuring out, you know, kind of what was, you know, what's the background of your house. The other 2 handouts, one about building types and forms. So this is just, this can kind of help you describing your property. Many of you have a residential type, so, you know, many of these sort of commercial types aren't going to be applicable to you, but it's still, you know, potentially useful information to talk about the different types of residences. The other one is really about style. And so this is an overview of architectural styles and just kind of when they were most popular. Because architectural styles, mine is black and white, yours should be in color. I think, Lynn, is it are these also available just online? Can you put a link or something? That would be great, because sometimes, you know, people mislay these and whatever. So just so everyone knows, helpful things. There are also a few links sprinkled in the slides that I'll be showing, the research slides that I'll be sharing here. So watch out for those. So places to look for information about your house or your property. Those can include deeds, any previous surveys. So I think I already talked about looking at the Oregon Sites database. Directories, that can be a really great one. So you look up, of course, you have to know a person's name, but you can connect them to where they lived or where they worked by looking at old directories. Census is also another one, and that one is available via the Multnomah Public Library. You can look up census data through 1950 now, which is awesome. Again, you have to have enough research under your belt that you have a name to use census data. Interviews can be a good one, and there are existing interviews, some of which have been transcribed, others you have to sit and listen to, but there are some great interviews with people who grew up in West Linn as children in like the 20s. I think I named one, Zena Marguerite Booz. Yeah, which is at Oregon Historical Society. There are a few others as well that are really interesting and you know, can illuminate kind of a neighborhood anyway for somebody who lived, you know, who grew up in a similar area as your house. Oh, nice. Okay, cool. Thanks for printing that out. The interviews that are at Oregon Historical, they are trying to remember. Yes, they are digitized, but not all of them have transcripts. Yeah. Newspapers, amazing source. And there are really 3 excellent newspapers that are, or sources that are searchable. So you can put in a term, you can put in a name, you can put in a street, you can put in an address, and you would be amazed at what you can find. One of those is the Historic Oregon Newspapers site. And it's a little spotty after, say, the 1920s. So it doesn't have everything digitized. For instance, the West Linn Tidings is not in there. But you'll find really old sort of Oregon City newspapers. So it just depends how useful that site is for what era that you're really interested in. The other two newspapers, though, are more statewide, the Oregon Journal and the Oregonian. And both of those you can access via the Multnomah Public Library again, and it is really fun. Yeah. 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 Good point. Sounds like you've done your research. Yes. Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, as an example, working on the McLean house, I found several articles that were spelled Maclean as opposed to MC. So you do have to kind of try again. But right, right. Yeah, good point. But um, just try different search terms. And honestly, that's many times the first place you should start for researching historic properties, because you'll find, even with just an address, you might find a past owner, and that gives you then the ability to go into census and, do further research. So newspapers are awesome.
Kristen,
Yeah.
what about, do they still have old phone books where you could, or reverse, or I don't know how they work, but
Yeah.
I
So
don't know how phone books work anymore. But
yeah, directories. Yeah. So
that
phone
seems really
books.
fun.
Yeah. I am not positive what West Linn Public Library has. I actually should have checked that out, but I know the like Multnomah County Library has all the directories, and they started doing reverse lookup, if you will, like pretty early in the 30s. I just looking at online at some of the West Linn directories, I don't remember them having that feature where you can, sort of look up an address and find who lived there. But also West Linn was pretty small at the time. So you can really, if you start having a clue of, what area, or, if you can find a name, that's always easiest. But so I wish I could tell you that I knew for sure if West Linn has the old directories, but you can find them online, and there's a link to do that through Multnomah.
So I also heard that you can look up, if you have names, you can look up old yearbooks.
Yes, yes, I have done that before. And actually, speaking of yearbooks, that is one thing that the West Linn Public Library has, is yearbooks going back to, 19, I don't know, 20s, 30s at least. Oh, and they're digitized. Hey, thank you. Okay, so getting all sorts of different ideas here. Yeah. Yeah. Deeds for Clackamas County are not searchable online, sadly. They are for just a few counties, though, like Polk for some reason. Anyway, you have to go in to the county building, and I think you have to make an appointment to do some deed research. They will talk you through it because generally what you're doing is sort of going back in time. So first you find, somebody who had the house before you, and then you look for, you know, who sold the property to that person. And so you're doing a sort of whole process of like, okay, and then there was the span before that and the span before that. So it takes a while. It does. Um, you can also hire a title company if you want to do it for you. And they, title companies do that deed research and dig. Yeah. What department? It's pretty clear if you look online, but I can't remember. Okay. Well, thank you for helping us out. Yeah. 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 It's a property. Good one. Yeah. CMAP. I've looked it up just like that. CMAP, Clackamas County, and it comes right up. Yeah. 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 John, I might ask for your help on this one. Is it through the building department? I know. Oh, there's quite a few Sears and Roebuck. That's cool. Nice. Yeah. Mm. 20s or 30s sounds right. Okay. John?
I'll just, yeah. So one thing as a staff person, as a city staff person, when I'm researching a property, I often will call over to Clackamas County or send an email. And I'll just mention two parts about that. They say the further back in time you go, becomes more art than science in terms of finding those records and interpreting what was going on. But also, if you want, every property has an associated tax map numbers or tax lot number. And the thing is, those tax lot numbers have a file that will document to greater to lesser degrees the history of that tax lot. And the tax lots are really intended for taxation purposes, but behind them are ownership records and events. And often that there's a card there at Clackamas County that will describe when it was created, when it was modified. And so you might get lucky. Oftentimes they're like, well, it was created in 1972 and that's all we have. But sometimes you can see an evolution. Well, farmer Bob Smith sold this part of the property to so-and-so. It became this new tax lot, or the subdivision happened. So sometimes you get lucky. Yeah. So there's I forget the name of the department. I think it's associated with the assessment office, but there's a cartography office. I think it is. I can't recall. I'll give up my cards. And if you want to follow up, I can give you a more precise name. I just don't have it. It just occurred to me just now. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's actually something a little different. Actually, these are their internal notes into themselves, and they're often on cards, and they just aren't, and they aren't published online. And they're really notes to future map makers, as they revise their maps. But they're not online. The tax lot numbers, but the data behind it in terms of when they were created and why they were changed. And I can, if you send me I'll leave my cards over here, and I can send some information out if you want. Offhand, I don't know. I know some of the oldest ones were knocked down about, in recent decades, but down in Fields Park, I believe. But offhand, I couldn't tell you. There's some pretty old ones here. Danny here might know offhand.
How old is the McLaughlin house? No, the McLaughlin house that was moved up above. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's Oregon City. Sorry. Yeah. Ooh. Oh, darn. Forgot the walls. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I'm not going to answer that one. Yeah. It's definitely a factor, but there are numerous properties that have been actually on the register and then they lose that designation if they get moved, but then somebody has it listed again on the National Register. So it's not a fatal blow by any means. You just have to kind of know about that and when it happened, and it becomes part of the story. I can't give you that because part of the, part of the other factors that go into a house's significance, maybe, the house is really tied to a person that was extremely important. And yeah, the house has lost a lot of integrity, but as long as it hasn't sort of lost all of it, I don't know. It's really a sliding scale. Partly has to do with rarity. partly with just perception. So if the changes that were done to the house still are in keeping with the character of it. I don't have any percentages for you though. Yeah, I think I think I have a slide about. Yeah, talk about that. Okay. I don't want to get too bogged down here in research, but let me just finish this one up. Another thing that is very useful and helpful is aerial photos. And I do have a couple of links. I think one of them is in this slide presentation, and then there might be another one on my 2-page form about looking for aerial photos and where you might start with that.
You could start on Westland Maps.
I'm getting to that. Oh, maps are awesome. Yeah. Sanborn Maps. So that is a huge and wonderful resource that actually shows each individual building on its lot during certain snapshots in time. So if you can find your house or building on a Sanborn map, those were primarily done as firefighting maps. And so the people who drew those really needed to know the type of construction, how many stories tall, good information that we historians really appreciate now. So I'm going to show you an example of a Sanborn map here in a minute. Actually, yes, Sanborn maps are available at the Library of Congress, and they're all digital. You can look at all the years available, and West Linn is mostly available as sort of the parts that were immediately across the river from Oregon City. So there's a lot that that isn't available, but the older parts are definitely available. John? Yeah, those links are broken. Okay. Okay. Great, great, great. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Right. Yeah. I don't think there are any for Bolton if I am right. So, next slide. For those of you who are looking at the printout of my slide presentation, this slide and the next one are recently inserted, so I apologize for that. But I really wanted to highlight the mapping resources that the city of West Linn has on their website because they're really excellent and useful. So what I'm showing on this first page are 2 different maps overlaid. And if any of you have PowerPoint on your home computer, it's really easy to make one map transparent so that you can just resize it and sort of figure out exactly how to overlay it on another map, which I find extremely useful when I'm trying to figure out, where features were or are and try to match up, 2 different map sources. So what we're looking at here, let's see, The black and white map is actually West Linn city boundaries, about 1967. And the reason I chose this map is because, remember, historic properties are eligible, probably, up to what, 1974 now, 50 years ago, right? So I'm not saying everything is eligible if it's, 1974 or earlier, but I am saying that, that's the first test. Is my property old enough? And so it's just interesting to look at the different annexations. And so that is the colored map that I have overlaid on the West Linn city boundaries map. And you can see there's sort of a brownish color, and that's, I called it orange here, annexed by 1975. The yellow is everything that was annexed up to 1965. So all the sort of older areas of West Linn in that bright yellow color. But remember, just because a property wasn't within West Linn city boundaries at some time, well, maybe now it is. There are plenty of old farmhouses that are, in the middle of a newer subdivision. So don't give up if your area was annexed much later. That doesn't necessarily mean that your house or property dates from that period. Next slide. This is just one other fun mapping exercise. So this one shows that same West Linn city boundaries, the sort of north end of it. And what I'm overlaying there, which I don't think you're going to be able to read very well, but this is thank you, Lynn. It's a USGS topographical historic map. And aside from aerial photos and the Sanborn maps, which I'll get to in a second, these maps are a great resource because they show every property for a certain date. So this USGS historic map, 1961, and although they're not really showing the actual shape of any one house, they're just using a dot, it's still very much, you can zoom in a way that you can't really see, I realize, on the screen, but you can zoom in and really see the real count of houses that were on any one street, by a certain date. So these areas are now annexed and in part of West Linn, and so they can be on the National Register as part of West Linn. They can be part of the local register as part of West Linn. And, even if they were built before they became part of West Linn, that's okay. That's part of its history. Let me see. I do a link to USGS maps. There's one coming up. Okay. So the city of West Linn not only has all of they don't have the USGS maps, but they have a lot of sewer and water maps starting from the early 20s, which is really interesting because it shows when different areas kind of got their infrastructure. And so when people started to really build up that neighborhood. So do take a look at the City of West Linn website and, see what you can find. So this link that I added in here is not in your, it's not in your handout for the presentation. So if you really want it, maybe Lynn, you could actually put this more recent presentation online too, so anyone can go ahead and upload it. But I'm showing two types of maps here. The one on the right I already talked about a little bit, which is those USGS historical topographic maps. And those go back to like 1905 or something, pretty early, and continue up through the 90s. I mean, you can find a lot of different dates, which are very helpful. The one on the left is called Metzger maps, and those were done to show property ownership. They don't really have a lot of information within built up urban areas. So they're most helpful when you're looking at parcels in the kind of more rural areas of a county, or, you know, even suburban areas a lot of times. But you can see when you pull up a Metzger map, it shows all the divisions of property and many times little numbers in each one. And what I'm not really showing you is on the side of each page, it just lists those numbers and says a name. So you can get property ownership at certain snapshots in time. I think Metzger maps, there's sort of one series that was done in the 20s, another one in the 30s, and then there's more recent ones as well in the 50s. Yes, there is a link to a good source that you can look those up through that link. Good question. Maybe later than that, maybe 70s or 80s. Yeah, that's a really good point, is that many times there are family connections, family archives, you know, people who know people. Oh, you should talk to so-and-so. And I guess I would encourage you to ask at the, you know, the historical society, museums, a lot of times sort of have sources for those people. And if you know, the people who lived in your house, say, before you should definitely give them a call and just say, hey, you know, do you know anything? You know, a lot of times they love talking about the past or their old house. So don't be scared. Just give it a try. Okay, I realize it's almost 7:30, so I'm going to try to wrap this up in no more than 10, and then we can. Good job. Great. Next slide, Lynn. Now, this is an example of what a Sanborn map looks like in a pretty urban area. So the map on the right, you see just a block, right? So that's a city block. It actually happens to be in Portland. downtown on the park blocks. And kind of the interesting thing that I wanted to point out that you can really see with Sanborn maps is some amazing detail about those buildings. So when I'm looking at the photograph on the left, it's basically a little house that's between two larger buildings, right? And when I go to the map on the right, I can see that house, right? Between, you know, that kind of larger square on the right, which is the apartment tower. And then there's a church on the left. And one thing, this is taken directly from, you know, teaching my students how to really look carefully at these Sanborn maps. There's a discrepancy between what I'm seeing on the right shown as the porch and the extension of that porch roof, which in the original Sanborn map, which I believe was 1911 or something like that, was shown as a whole width porch, right? That line comes all the way across the front of that little house. Well, so now I know when I'm looking at my house that at some point somebody cut that porch back, right? So things like that, you know, it's amazing to have a map that can give you detail like that. It can tell you how many stories, it can tell you, you know, basically what else was on the property, how big the property was. So it's such a wealth of information, but again, I apologize for those, you know, who are looking for this type of information, and there's not going to be Sanborn maps for everywhere in West Linn for sure. Next slide. I'm going to go over this one really quickly. This is definitely a National Register only kind of analysis, but it is important to compare the property that you're trying to list with other similar properties. And the example that I'm showing here is when I did write the nomination of the Historic City Hall, that was important at a statewide level. So I pulled other examples of similar municipal buildings that were built during the same era under the PWA or WPA. Anyway, part of the New Deal after the Great Depression. So I had to sort of pull out these other examples and then talk about why, in particular, the West Linn Historic City Hall deserved to be on the National Register. That's not to say that, you know, all of the others didn't, but just that it had enough integrity as compared to similar buildings. And you would do a similar exercise depending on, you know, the significance argument here. Next slide. So just very briefly again, the National Register nomination is divided up into two sort of larger narrative sections. One of them being the Section 7, as it's called. So this just lays out a description of the building and then talks about any changes that have occurred over time. Next slide. And then the other large narrative section in the National Register nomination is Section 8. And that's the part that really just sort of tells the story, right? It makes the case for significance, and it really tells when the property was important or when it was built, and explain a little bit more about the significance. So this image on the bottom is a very important civil rights leader in Oregon, and he and his wife were long-term residents of West Linn. So I certainly haven't surveyed his house, but potentially it's eligible for the National Register based on who lived there. Next one. Okay, very briefly here again, period of significance. So this changes depending on your significance argument. If you're talking about an important event, you're going to talk about a duration or period of time that that association took place or the event took place. If you're talking about a person, it's really how long they were associated with the property. If you're talking about architecture, it's generally just the year that it was constructed, 1 year. And then if you're talking about archaeology, it can be a pretty long time period. Almost done here. And this is basically just to sort of remind you that you do need to properly cite all your sources throughout the document. Go back to your, your papers that you had to write in college or whatever. But you do have to develop a bibliography, use the right kind of layout for your bibliography and all your footnotes. And you will be required to put in geographical coordinates, but there's information in the state sort of primer on how to write a National Register nomination of how to do that. So it really talks you through that.
Maybe you could get AI to write your citations.
That would be great, actually. Next. Finally, you're going to have to be responsible for taking photographs of your house or property. And again, the guide published by the SHPO walks you through how to take those photographs. But I want to just encourage you to, if you don't have a digital SLR camera, try to borrow one, because although cell phones are getting better, they're still not of that extremely high resolution that you're going to need for your National Register photos. So get your hands on a decent camera and just go out, and you might have to do it a couple times because inevitably you're going to forget one side or not include a detail, and you're going to be going back. But if you live there, that makes it easier. And then you're also going to look for historic photos. Sometimes they're really just not available, but anything that helps you make the case. I've seen people put in little newspaper articles even. I've seen, matchbooks, photographs of them. I've seen all sorts of things added as sort of historic figures or information in the back of a National Register nomination. So those things can all be kind of evidence. Next slide. And this one I also put in so that we could briefly go over the local register. This I just took from the city code. So I hope I got this, right. But designation of a historic resource in West Linn has approval criteria, which hopefully are going to sound fairly familiar to you. They are first, and a property again only has to meet one of these 5 criteria to be eligible for listing. Events, so it's associated with an event or events that made a significant contribution to the history of the city. 2, people, lives of significant person or people. architecture embodies distinctive architectural characteristics. Construction represents the work of a master builder, designer, or architect. And then finally, archaeology. So you can see that these are the same criteria really that are used at every level. And so when you turn in your application for a local listing, you do need this narrative that explains the significance or why you meet the criteria on the left. And you need site plan, you need different photos, historic photos if you can find them, and maps, any supplementary documentation. And again, that might be, anything from newspaper articles to matchbooks, as I cited, anything that helps make your case. And then finally, owner consent. It's a really important concept here in Oregon. Owners get to consent to have their properties listed. So if you don't own a property, if you're renting, you cannot by yourself list a property. The owner has to agree. Yeah, I am so glad you can't see my desk right now. I have an unfortunate horizontal layering system that doesn't work that well for me. I'm a lot more organized online, I have to say. I make folders and I really keep, for instance, newspaper articles, and I name them in such a way that I always put the date first, the year, just the date. And then, they fall into order just naturally that way. And I can sort of find them again if there's like 30 stacked up in there. And then I just really start making folders for all sorts of things. I wish I did that for my, physical notes and printouts better than I do. But yes, writing a National Register nomination or even a local one, get yourself a bound little notebook and take all your notes in there, because if not, you're going to end up like me and writing on the back of your water bill or something. And it's just, yeah, it's so great to just start with a little notebook, and that way you just take it with you everywhere. You go to the library, or making notes in there. You have it in one place. That's about all I can say about organization. I do my best. John. I would love that. Yeah.
Mike.
Mike.
So just really fast, I'll just come up and be quick about this. Getting it listed locally it's not a scary process. So I think first off, there are no fees involved. So city councils decide to waive all fees for this process. You can also call city planning staff anytime, talk to me, talk to my colleagues. You can walk in 9 a.m. to noon, Monday through Thursday, and talk to us. It's really like a two-part process. There is the application, but before the application, we have what's called a pre-application process. You fill out a form and say, I'd like to talk to someone about submitting an application to be locally designated. What that gets you is an hour of time in a room with me or someone else, and probably some research beforehand. And that way we will walk you through the whole application process, kind of say, here's how to organize it, here's some good resources maybe, and talk about that. And then you would go and you would gather materials mentioned above, and any photographs you can find in your bibliography and resources. And then once you prepare the application, you give it to the city, and then staff draws up a report and gives it to the Historic Review Board. So those are 7 citizens appointed by city council. They're all experts or have strong interest in historic preservation. And then they make a recommendation to city council. And that's it. And so really the city has a lot of control over what it declares as its own history. The National Register nomination process is very prestigious, and Westland is very lucky to have a half dozen properties on the National Register, plus a district. But we also have 25 homes that are individually listed around the city as local landmarks. And something not everyone realizes is that while we have a National Register historic district down in Willamette, we also have a local historic district in the same area that's actually a little bit bigger. And so while a core portion was eligible for the National Register, there was a bigger portion the city decided was actually worth commemorating. So at the end of the day, give us a call. We'll help you, point you in the right direction. But thank you. Yeah, they are sort of similar. So basically, that's a good segue. So in terms of benefits, you get sort of local prominence. The city will celebrate the listing on that. It also will preserve your house in perpetuity, in the sense that there's a demolition review process that will, it's a really high bar to demolish the house. So if you love your house, but you worry about it in 50 years, there's that control. If it does get on the National Register, the city does administer federal grants for restoration projects. You want to, rebuild a lost portion of your house, or you want to do something or another. I will say that it doesn't freeze your house in time. So all buildings are living buildings. New technology comes along, new needs. Who knew we'd all be working from home? There are now energy requirements. So there's a lot of balancing, and really buildings survive when they have a purpose and people are living in them and investing in them. So there is a review process for any external alteration. And there are 3 categories of review. One is just exempt work. So, we don't care about paint color. You're doing basic maintenance. That's not something the city is going to regulate. Small changes, it's a staff review with a notice to your neighbors to give them the opportunity to comment. But if it's a bigger change, say you want to do like an addition, or you want to build like a small accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, that would actually go to the Historic Review Board for their review and comment. So again, buildings change, but the goal here is to make sure that the integrity of the buildings maintained, that the window patterns and the overall form. So it's good and bad, and the city also subsidizes those design review applications. So if you do have to alter your house, it's $100 fee. So that doesn't come close to covering our costs, but it just makes sure that your house maintains its integrity. Yes.
Getting free money seems like a good deal. Yeah. I think that's really the last slide. My last slide was just a, thank you slide. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free and we'll try to. It is part of the case that you make on national, if you're going for National Register. I don't think a local property designation really cares about the interior, and there's no review for changes in either case. So, if there are historic features, it's great to talk about them, but if there aren't, yeah. Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah. I appreciate having you local experts here. It's great. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. John. Yeah.
The city does not have the 50-year rule in terms of eligibility. So I will say, traditionally, the city is focused on the sort of earlier time period for historic designation, 1930s. Westland grew quite a bit after the war. So there's a whole host of mid-century homes out there, other buildings that really tell a very important part of the city's history. So if you have a great 1950s, 1960s house, even 1970s house, there could be, a reason to lift it. So just, I was born in 73. And it's crazy to think about, you know, about homes at that time period becoming eligible. So, but essentially, I mean, mid-century modern is quite hot. I can think of a few houses in town. So again, it doesn't have to be a 19 teens, house that provided shelter to a mill worker 100 years ago. It can be something more recent.
For the Cosmos County Rural Society, and they actually want to get rid of it. And just file of documentation, they're like, this is West Linn, Ireland was not good, so we're taking from the back, I we don't have a physical building or a structure, we're all on. Like, actually, what we did tonight, that's what we want to know for us, what's all digitized, we don't have a building.
It's the future.
And we have help with it. All of the old high school newspapers we digitized 5 years ago. So we can go back to the 1920s high school newspaper now. Do the back to the one of the organic statements. Yeah, it was on there digitized. It was all about two pages where we digitized.
Yay. Yeah.
You have to stop by old things if you want to try to send them our way. We'll try to digitize.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah, the conventions for naming a house or, a property, it's supposed to be, for the first owner who lived in the house. Although sometimes that can be for somebody really significant who came along after that first owner. But the way that you can access the sort of, just what goes into the survey is by contacting SHPO, and they will send you the survey report. And it has the sort of listings for each property that they surveyed, and we'll have some more information than is available on their website. So you can ask for that, and they're happy to send it to you because they're helpful people. Ah. Yeah. Yeah, I got no more than that. Yeah. Yeah, CMAP is great.
Years. So any house plans are not present after 2 years. We do retain a lot of older building permit cards though. So you can say, oh, in 1957, Jane Doe pulled a plumbing permit for this house. That could clue you into maybe they built a bathroom, an addition or something like that. In my own house, actually, I don't live in West Linn, but I found the city where I live, I found a plumbing card that sort of gave me clues to a bathroom addition to my house. So you can do that through a public records request online. So if you go to the city website, and then I think there's at the top of the page, there's a section that says, how do I? Pull that down and then you can request records. And you just say, I want all building permit records for this address. And then, sometimes you get nothing, sometimes you'll get a lot. It's kind of hit and miss. The further back you go in time, the less reliable it gets. But yeah, so I would also say do a public records request for your property address with the city.
I do realize that my collection of National Register printouts is still around the room. If you really, really want to keep it, that's okay. But I would appreciate them back if you're, just going to sort of toss it, because I like having some in physical form. My